You. Thanks, Mike, for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about why my integration team is lying to me. We're going to have a conversation about risk in M&A, and hopefully get some insights and share with the folks that will join us and watch this podcast. So, just in the way of introductions, I'm Pekka Metsäranta. I'm the founder and CEO of Sisua. I've worked on a number of transformation programs and M&A programs, and love to share some insights from those.
Awesome. Pekka, I love the title, right? Just kind of comes out and says, why is your team lying? And I don't think the team's lying intentionally, but I'm Mike Princi. I run a business called Thought Strategic Capital, and I have been helping folks with transaction-based growth for the last 20 years. So we do both buy side, sell side, and integration and divestiture work with our clients. So really happy to be here, Pekka, and start digging in to why deals sometimes don't work, and why sometimes there's a tendency for our team not to want to reveal the truth.
All right. So why are we talking about this topic? So just some stats for folks. Harvard Business Review tells us that about 70% of mergers still fail. Sometimes they don't actually look like they're failing during the deal stage or the integration phase, but they don't realize the value that's actually being put in. So, and we've seen that quite a lot. And there is a common view that actually people don't make a bad deal. It's the integration teams that mess it up, or the guys who actually operationalize. So we want to dispel some of those myths and just share a little bit about what we've seen. So I think, Mike, I think where we want to just start with is some of the foundations, right? So what are the biggest risks from your side that you've seen in M&A? And I guess what are those insights that we can share with folks as to what to look out for?
No, it's a great question, and it's a topic that is near and dear to my heart, because a lot of my work is spent trying to help folks manage and mitigate those risks. The biggest risk in a deal is that it doesn't get what you wanted it to get. Right? You have this kind of interesting construct, and I've seen it in time and time, where you have two separate teams. You have a team doing the deal or setting the value, and then you have a separate team that's actually getting the value. And a lot of times the organizational structure of those teams, the tools that they're using, the way that they communicate are at odds with each other, and it creates a really large risk. Now, what are those risks, and why are the reasons that deals don't achieve what you expected them to achieve? Well, I think first and foremost, it comes back to just a couple things that are happening, right? We've talked before about things like deal fever, right? You want to get this deal done, and there's a team that has a set of incentives that are to get the deal done. There's also this sense, sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, particularly in competitive bid situations, where there's this crazy pace to M&A deals. Like, oh, we got the book, we've got to put this together. We don't have time to do a lot of really detailed planning for this deal. We just got to get this thing done. And you got a team then that closes the deal and throws over the wall now a deal for an integration team to come in. That team also probably has a different leadership. They have different incentives. They have different tools, different experiences that they're bringing to that. And that's really, I think, one of the first layers where you're starting to achieve risk is that difference in mindset, all of the things around mindset, like incentive systems and tools that start to place that out. Now, where do those risks play out? Well, they're in a bunch of places. So before we move on to where those risks are, what are you seeing in terms of that schism between pre-deal and post-deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it can start even before then. So some of the clients that we've been working with, they're just buying companies. So they don't actually have a plan necessarily, or they don't have a strategic intent. It's more around, I want that company over there. How do I actually get this done? Without really thinking about, well, what is the strategy? What is the true value that I intend to get? And it's based on assumption that value is there if I just buy enough things. So I see that as a real challenge. And then, like you mentioned, I think for me, that integration team planning perhaps starts a little bit too late. There is this notion that there is a pre-deal phase and an integration phase, but the planning for the integration part, which is what we specialize in, starts early. I mean, you can't start it as the deal is closing. You have to start it months in advance to understand the dependencies and the structures. And that's where I see that the biggest challenge is. And ultimately, on both sides, it's about resource. Do you have enough people? Do you have the right people? Are you backfilling enough? Are you supporting the teams to actually do their day jobs? This is not side of desk activity, and also being able to execute everything that needs to be executed.
No, you raise a great point around a strategy first approach. And you're right. There's a lot of banker originated deal volume that's all about we've got this thing. Everyone else has one of these things. You don't have one. AI is a great topic for that. I recently was working with a media company, start thinking about data investments and everything around identity and audience development. And there was just always this fear of we haven't done a deal our competitors have, and it wasn't driven, as you said, by strategy. And that's a huge aspect to that. In the context of starting to think about, well, how do you start putting these two things together? And I think one of our success points is you start that post-merger planning the day you get the book. So you've signed the NDA, you're going to get some information, and we've coined a phrase called DIDAR, right? We're taking that data, trying to generate insights immediately so we can make decisions. And in a lot of cases, those decisions are about, well, what is the integration plan? And even when you're not integrating operations, there's still an integration element to that often gets overlooked. And then turning those into the actions and ultimately the results that are going to play out. But starting that immediately and bringing one of those, just sharp-toothed, sharp-eyed operator mindset people that are typically part of the integration team, bringing them and allowing them to work with, the Excel-driven, kind of number-driven, value-obsessed folks that are doing the deals, and really starting to have difficult conversations earlier that will lead to better deals.
Yeah, and I also think on that topic, I think it's important to set up the governance structures for both at the same time. So actually, the governance you take to the deal to drive things, to drive insight, to manage risk, and to be able to get the deal done needs to then live on as much as possible into the integration phase. It may change. You may have to have different mechanisms and different gates and different activities, but the control and the way that sponsors work and the way that teams are fused together needs to be very similar. And ideally, some of those pre-deal folks actually go into the integration side as well. To inform where the value needs to be and actually steer that the ultimate benefits are realized. So I think that's extremely important in managing some of that risk.
No, absolutely. And you and I have seen situations where it feels like mid golf swing, right? You got a deal execution team backing up, kind of making contact with the ball, and then throwing the club to somebody else to deliver the execution. And to your point earlier around, I don't make bad deals. It's the integration people that screw it up, right? That's a cultural issue that we have to deal with just very different experiences that brought those two people to that point. One being much more operational, one being much more financial and banker oriented. And what I've found works really well is to try and have an advocate. That person doesn't need to be the day-to-day, but they need to be the advocate from ideation in that deal right through deal disposition, typically to the return into business as usual, or in some cases into a divestiture environment. And that person plays somewhat of an operator partner mindset in that. That could be an integration lead, that could be a deal lead, doesn't necessarily need to come from one or the other side. But the other piece in lieu of doing that is just make it one team. Right? When you start thinking about the synergies that have to happen in a deal and the complexities of getting to those synergies, and then the deal speed at what's happening pre-deal, where you're putting numbers in and you've caught deal fever. In a lot of cases, you've got to make the numbers work to make the deal work, particularly in a competitive bid situation where you might have to bid up an asset for that.
Yeah, and more often than not, I guess in my experience, the pre-deal teams are actually the same people that have to do the integration, because you have to draw in functional experts to gather data, to understand process, to understand what those benefits might be as part of the deal, and they're the guys that actually have to make it real post deal in a merger or divestiture situation. So I do think that there's it is key what you said about one team, and it's also at the end of the day, it's one deal that needs to
Yeah.
drive as many benefits as possible. So I guess you mentioned the human elements here. So one of the key questions I think in all risk managing risk is, how do you know that there is actually a lot of risk? I mean, one obvious answer is, well, if you've got a risk log, it's full of stuff, right? But there's a whole bunch of human behaviors, people that are people doing things that maybe tell us that there's a symptom, there is a problem which may not be in that risk log. And some of those that we've seen to date are, people only reporting green when they're talking about their work streams, either pre-deal or during the integration. They just say everything's fine, don't worry. And then when you start to have a conversation with them, they start to tell you all about the nuances of all the challenges, the risks, not understanding their process, not understanding their races, not understanding the dependencies, and actually starting to share that. Or you see a lot of stretched resource out there that actually is too busy to do the day job, and the organization starts to suffer, which tells you not only are you breaking the organization itself as it was, but your deal is going to start to go the wrong way if they can't focus and actually execute. So those are some of the things that we see. But what behaviors or human things have you seen?
Oh, wow. So you hit it, right? It's kind of a 3C approach, right? You got culture, you've got communication, and you've got capacity, right? So I'll take them apart one by one. I like you have sat in those meetings where you're in an update and you're listening to an update, and you're looking at the pre-read for that meeting, and you see there's no risks and issues listed, and it's rated green, and then there's a 5-minute dialogue about why the thing has risks and issues, and it might not even use the words risks and issues. So we have a problem with this, or we can't get in touch with that person, but basically they now talk to you about all those things that are going to keep you from getting what you wanted in that deal, right? So that's the first piece. Now, why does that happen culturally? Well, a lot of cultures, that red on a raid log implies failure, right? And
Oh,
I
and
would
you're going to
always
get
try.
shot, right? If you put it on a piece of paper, somebody's going to shoot you because it's not, it's unacceptable.
It's
It's
unacceptable. It implies either I'm not doing my job or I need help and I'm capable of doing my job. But there's a tremendous amount of decision power in that, right? As a leader, I can make decisions to reallocate resources. I can make decisions to change the target. I can make, there's this whole amount of value that gets lost in the decisions that could come out of a raid log that's red. Whew, it's a tough statement. Not enough
it's a
caffeine,
mouthful.
apparently. But the second piece is that vocabulary and that human aspect, right? So this fear that I'm going to raise a risk in a deal that looks like everybody else's areas are going well, right? So you get this kind of reinforcing effect that when no one's talking about these things. But you mentioned earlier, 70% of deals fail, according to that HBR study. Right? That's just a risky environment in general. So
Mm.
we've got some cultural things that are happening there. The second is the communications, and I think there's a common vocabulary that as basically integration leaders we're able to overlay, um, and that vocabulary goes well beyond the basis of the project nature of an integration. It starts to think about the fact that that integration is about a whole business. It's not
Mm.
just the integration synergies that you're getting, and the communication through that tends to have a couple things that end up happening, right? The schism between what you described earlier of I have my day job and then I have my side of desk job, right? So I might be a sales leader and I'm working my sales pipeline, and then I have some integration manager talking to me about synergy sales, and I'm just mind share cleaved in that communication where they're using different words, they're using different tools than the sales pipeline I'm using. So one of the things is just try and get all of those communications barriers down. So you got the cultural piece, you got the communications piece, and then you got the capacity. Right? If I'm
Mm.
doing one job, to ask me to do a second job is pretty challenging. And that's where a lot of the things that we propose around simplifying complexity, using a systems approach, thinking about standard reporting, thinking about bringing more numeracy in so I can rely on more objective than subjective red, amber, green, coding of things. So those are a couple things that we're seeing in a couple ways that we're trying to bring tools to folks to help mitigate some of that just intrinsic risk and managing risk.
Yeah, and I would second the communication, right, and the transparency piece. A lot of the time, it's uh, standard program management, visual management type activities, right? Get it on a board to track progress so that people can actually say, "Here's where I'm at," and then you can see if things are slipping. You can actually identify if there are challenges. Make sure that those KPIs are defined, right? At the start, we said earlier, if what is the purpose of this, and what is driving those KPIs, so you can measure how you're doing, not only in terms of progress of getting to the deal and getting through the integration, but also in terms of value, right? Are you actually realizing things? Are you increasing those sales that you said you were going to increase? And how does that work, right? And then I think on the culture piece, absolutely critical, right? I think it's every transformation leaders, every program leaders, every leader's really responsibility to make it okay to say, hey, I've got a problem here
Yeah.
and I need help, right? And that's what the red is telling us. And if it's not culturally acceptable, then it's our job to make it acceptable or provide that shield that at least we know where the problems are and we can face them. So that clarity of challenge and risk and being able to come and talk to the leaders is key. And then I think the other one that we didn't really talk about, but is low morale, right? Sometimes because of the fast-paced nature of these things and because of the nature of any merger or divestiture, as the case may be, people are people, right? They may have fear. They may be worried about their jobs. They may be worried about all kinds of things, and
Yeah.
actually spotting those worries highlights risk, and it may highlight process risk, and later how do you operate and all those kind of things
Yeah.
that need to be tackled. So they need to be got on the table. Um, for me, I guess having experienced a lot of these complex programs, the other thing that is allows us to understand where there is risk is that feeling, right? Sometimes you just know that something is wrong. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you know you got to go digging, and that's what I think expertise and experience really brings to the table. And I would encourage anyone who is in these positions to really, if you think it might be wrong, go prodding, go and investigate, and go find out because
Oh,
what you
absolutely.
what you
Yeah.
don't what you don't go uncover will bite you later. So it really is worth it.
No, and you raised what I think is the really important part of this that's often underplayed and often put into the package of a separate work stream called culture, right? Which is not a separate work stream, right? It should be imbued in every one of your work streams. But we've often see that that's gets compartmentalized, and it's a brown bag lunch, or you're doing information. Every deal's made up of people. Whether you're buying a tech deal, AI company, I still need to retain the people, and need to retain the customers. And when you see interesting things like we're changing the operating model, we're moving, for example, in a deal that we were working with, we were moving a lot of the what we were deeming lower level skills over to offshore locations. And the message that was inadvertently being sent was you're next on getting, so you're working on this integration wondering when is my name going to be called out that I'm leaving. And when folks are sitting there and they're trying to hold that stiff upper lip and they're trying to sit in a culture where there is a sense of failure, that's just a form of feedback, right? Failure is not a thing, it's a feedback mechanism where you're sitting and getting that anxiety. That person's going to decide to leave, and we see it time and time again. And if you've not really thought through not just the retention of that person, but also having a contingency plan for, well, what if that person leaves, right? That
100%.
side of it, start to think in depth around talent development, starting to think in depth around retention, starting to think in depth around succession planning are really things that a lot of those culture folks can bring some tremendous assets, tremendous experience. So you got that kind of specialism so that we're prepared for that,
And
right?
it has to be done from the get-go, right? It's not a do
Right
it
from the
during the
outset.
integration, or it has to be done at the start to think about, well, how do we cover this? Especially once you need the subject matter experts, right, that are critical to any of these organizations. If they leave midway through the process, it all falls apart. So it's
Well,
it's
if they're even
absolutely
thinking
critical.
about leaving, right? They're interviewing, they're doing other things because no one just leaves a job for the sake of leaving a job. So you're not only having that person do their primary job, they have to do their side of desk job in the integration, but they're also looking for another job, right? So when they've got that many balls in the air, they're going to be stressed. Morale's going to be low. They're going to be frustrated. They're going to be communicating poorly, right? Because it's just all of those things that end up as that confluence that becomes the death spiral that leads to 70% of deals not succeeding. So what do we
Yeah.
do with this? What's the way out?
Well, I think some of the basics, to be honest. How do you manage risk, right? I think that's the ultimate question here. And I think the simplest part of this is actually through some pretty basic program management, governance type activities, right? Start with a RAID log. Risks, actions, issues, dependencies. Sometimes assumptions is thrown in there as well, depending on if you want 2 A's in the RAID or not. But actually having a log, having it curated, making sure it actually drives decisions and it drives actions, and having very clear escalation paths and very clear program structure, I think helps a lot in terms of managing, and it's about being able to jump in. And for me, I think the other way to manage risk is just having the right teams, right? So having ways of dealing with the risk, having sufficient capacity. I mean, you mentioned it previously, right? Backfilling some of those old roles, actually bringing in those experts who know how to lead work streams and drive things forward and understand some of these nuances so that the experts can get on with being experts in what they do. And I think that that helps quite a bit and is actually the foundation of managing risk in itself. What do you think?
No, I think you're hitting it right on the head. There's a couple things I would add that would bolster what you just said. Right? The first is taking a systems approach. You're taking a business which is a system that converts capital into enterprise value. Right? So you're smashing that with another system. So just intrinsically putting two systems together causes all kinds of work. So keeping a systemic view of the business through the entire process from day one as you're thinking about what are the integration and acquisition benefits right through the transition to BAU. I think the
And
second
when you
thing, go
and
ahead.
just when you say systems, right, you mean systems in their broadest possible term.
Systems
So
in their
not
broadest
IT
possible term,
systems,
right?
but systems is
Absolutely.
process and governance and all of those kind of things, right? And
Yes, the
approach and
amalgamation of all those things, including the data that's available for it, the insights you're able to generate from that system, and how it's going to integrate. Right? Just think about retention as a system, or HR as a system. It's not just Workday or Gusto, depending on the size of deal that you're doing. That's not your system. That's your IT system to support that system. But yes, it's a much broader term. I think the second is the RAID log. Right? There's a lot of folks that view the RAID log as something that should. I've had people say to me, I don't want a lot of things on my RAID log, which means you're deliberately ignoring a risk. So get it out there. It's going to be comprehensive. It's a log. It's going to have a lot of stuff. It's going to evolve with every conversation. And that's the piece that if you don't have a good way of capturing onto your RAID log, memorializing those decisions is the D that I tend to use rather than dependency. But starting to think about making sure that RAID log is actually a tool that gets curated and prioritized for what the current use of it is, which is the reporting. How do you raise certain risks and issues that you're choosing to address at that moment in time? A lot of times you're just going to accept the risk. You can't squash every risk. So getting a better use of the RAID plan, the RAID log, and then always just thinking about your deal structure and your integration are really your first two bites at mitigating risk in this deal. Because if you're doing the deal, you've chosen not to avoid the risk. So now you have to think about, well, how do I address the risk? Those are a couple things I think in addition.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the last one is really around it is that cultural piece we talked about earlier, right? It's about creating that psychological safety, shall we call it, that actually says, hey, if you've got some risk, raise them, right? Red is okay. Actually, let's get these things on the table and then we can decide, are we going to mitigate? Are we going to accept, or are we just going to do something else, right? But at least they need to be on the table so that they don't come out of the woodwork. So I think there's a cultural aspect on this, and that's a tough one, and it actually requires confidence and leadership to break through it, especially if the organization is wired slightly differently. So I think that's a real challenge sometimes.
Yeah, and a couple things I've tried to do with that. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as bad or good news. It's how we respond to it. There's only news, right? If you get organizations realizing, hey, this is the news, and a lot of times that news again has tremendous decision value. It's a change in the operating conditions in which we're working. We thought customers were going to buy this. Customers aren't buying this. Not bad news. Change in the operating conditions. And if you could start to create a culture that allows for that level of conversation. The second real thing is, the bad news doesn't get better with time. After I just said there's no such thing as bad news, when people take it and go, oh my gosh, this is bad news, sometimes they believe it will fix itself or it will get better in time.
Yeah,
And
it's
I,
so
I think
unlikely, isn't
100% of the
it?
time that never happens, right? So those are the two things regarding that aspect of trying to get better communication about what's happening in the operating environment of the business.
So what would we like people to take away from this conversation, right? I mean, for me, it's
Yeah,
if you're seeing things being ignored or misunderstood, or people just don't understand how to manage risk, then here's some food for thought, right? And there are people out there like us who can actually help, either pre-deal or post-integration. So I think it's absolutely critical. And for me, if there's if risk management is not being prioritized in these major programs, that should be a red flag in itself. And that actually is
absolutely.
a time to really think about, well, how do you reprioritize it and make it number one on people's agenda.
Yeah, so I think we solved the issue as to why our integration teams are lying. That's not their fault, right? That's a confluence of culture, capacity, and communications that are causing the messages to get muddled or even just muted in that regard. But you're absolutely right. We bring the chip teeth, the blackened eyes, and the skinned knees of operating in these special circumstances called the integrating company. And those experiences are important because a lot of times you're going to have really strong specialists and functional leads. This may be their first deal,
Mm.
right? And they bring that great expertise. They're going to bring very different experiences together. And you're trying to take this group that may never have worked together before and may never work together again after this and get them to do great things, right? The great things that were aspired by that original deal sponsor to say, man, this is going to get us a lot of value. So absolutely right. Where do they find us, Becca?
Where do they find us?
Yeah, where do
Well,
they
you can
find
reach out
us?
to us over LinkedIn or our websites. Sisua's website's www.sisua.co.uk, SISUA, or you can reach out via email. We are here to help. Mike,
Good.
where can they find you?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you find me at mike@thoughtstorm.com, happy to chat with you about some of the more deliberate things that we're able to do and even share our thoughts, but always happy to talk M&A. Thank you very much for
Amazing.
inviting me, Pekka. I really enjoyed
Oh,
the conversation.
thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Excellent.